Breaking news today that could have a major impact on firearm regulations across the United States. A federal court is now moving closer to permanently blocking the controversial pistol brace rule, a regulation that could have affected millions of gun owners nationwide. For months, this rule has been the center of intense legal battles, constitutional debates, and political controversy. But now, a new court development suggests the regulation may soon be stopped nationwide for good. The rule focuses on firearms equipped with pistol stabilizing braces and how they are classified under federal law. A pistol brace is an accessory that attaches to the rear of a firearm originally designed to be fired with one hand. These braces were initially marketed as devices intended to help stabilize the firearm during shooting, particularly for individuals who may have difficulty controlling recoil with one hand. For years, many firearm owners legally purchased pistols with these braces after regulatory guidance suggested that attaching a brace did not automatically turn the firearm into a different legal category. However, the newer federal regulation changed how these firearms are interpreted under the law. According to the rule, many firearms that use stabilizing braces may now be considered short-barreled rifles, commonly referred to as SBRs. Under the National Firearms Act of 1934, short-barreled rifles are placed in a special category of regulated firearms. Owners of these types of firearms are typically required to register them with the federal government, submit identifying information, and pay a tax stamp before legally possessing them. The process can also involve background checks and approval from federal authorities. The controversy surrounding the rule largely comes from the scale of its impact. Estimates suggest that millions of these brace-equipped firearms were sold in the United States over the past decade. Many gun owners purchased them legally based on earlier interpretations of the law. When the rule was introduced, critics argued that it suddenly reclassified a large number of commonly owned firearms into a category that requires strict federal oversight. Supporters of the regulation argue that the physical design and functionality of some brace-equipped firearms make them similar to short-barreled rifles, which have long been regulated under federal law. Opponents, however, say the rule effectively changes the legal status of firearms that were previously considered lawful without new legislation from Congress, which is one of the main reasons the regulation quickly became the subject of multiple court challenges across the country. Soon after the rule was introduced, it faced immediate legal challenges from several gun rights organizations, firearm manufacturers, and individual gun owners. The central argument from these groups is that the regulation represents a major shift in firearm classification that should not have been created through agency rulemaking alone. They argue that changing how millions of firearms are regulated is a decision that should come directly from Congress through legislation rather than from a federal agency interpreting existing law in a new way. One of the primary concerns raised in the lawsuits is that the rule could affect millions of firearms that were purchased legally under earlier regulatory guidance. For years, stabilizing braces were widely sold and used based on prior interpretations, suggesting that attaching a brace to a pistol did not automatically turn it into a short-barreled rifle. Many firearm owners relied on those earlier interpretations when making purchases, believing they were fully complying with federal law. The lawsuits argue that suddenly redefining these firearms could place lawful owners in a difficult legal position without clear warning or new legislation. Another key argument in the legal challenges centers on administrative authority. Plaintiffs claim the agency responsible for the rule exceeded the authority granted to it by Congress. According to these arguments, federal agencies are responsible for enforcing laws passed by Congress, but they cannot create entirely new regulatory frameworks that significantly expand existing statutes. In this view, reclassifying a large category of firearms effectively rewrites the scope of the National Firearms Act without lawmakers approving such a change. Several lawsuits also raise constitutional questions, particularly regarding due process and the clarity of federal regulations. Critics say the rule's criteria for determining whether a firearm qualifies as a short-barreled rifle can be complex and subjective, which could lead to confusion about what is legal. Because of these concerns, multiple federal courts were asked to review the rule and decide whether it should be blocked while the legal challenges move forward through the judicial system. The latest development in the case centers on a federal court reviewing whether the current restrictions on enforcing the pistol brace rule should be expanded and potentially made permanent while the legal battle continues. Earlier in the case, several courts had already issued temporary injunctions that prevented the rule from being enforced against specific individuals or organizations that were directly involved in the lawsuits. These decisions were designed to protect the plaintiffs, while the courts examined the legal arguments surrounding the regulation. However, those earlier protections were limited in scope. In many cases, the injunctions only applied to members of particular gun rights groups or to the specific parties who filed the lawsuits. This created a complicated situation where some firearm owners were protected from enforcement of the rule while others were not, depending on whether they were connected to the plaintiffs involved in the litigation. Because of this uneven application, the issue of broader relief quickly became a central topic in court proceedings. Now, the court is considering whether the existing block on the rule should be expanded into a nationwide injunction. A nationwide injunction would mean that the rule could not be enforced anywhere in the United States while the case continues to move through the legal system. Instead of only protecting certain individuals or organizations, such an order would temporarily stop the rule from being applied to anyone. Courts sometimes issue nationwide injunctions when they believe a regulation could cause widespread legal confusion, or when the policy being challenged affects a large number of people across the country. In this situation, the argument for a broader injunction is based on the fact that millions of firearms equipped with stabilizing braces exist nationwide and are owned by individuals who may be affected by the rule. If the court ultimately decides to expand the injunction nationwide, it would represent a significant development in the case. It would not necessarily determine the final legality of the rule, but it would pause enforcement across the entire country while judges continue reviewing the constitutional and legal arguments presented by both sides. If a nationwide block is issued, it would temporarily stop the enforcement of the pistol brace rule across the entire United States while the legal challenges continue in court. This type of order, known as a nationwide injunction, would apply to everyone rather than just the individuals or organizations directly involved in the lawsuit. In practical terms, that means federal authorities would not be able to enforce the regulation against firearm owners anywhere in the country until the courts reach a final decision on the legality of the rule. One of the most immediate effects of such a block would be the suspension of requirements connected to the rule. The regulation originally required certain firearms equipped with stabilizing braces to be treated as short-barreled rifles under federal law. If enforcement is paused nationwide, firearm owners would not be required to follow those specific compliance measures while the injunction remains in place. This could include things like registration requirements or other regulatory steps tied to the classification of those firearms under the National Firearms Act. Another important aspect of a nationwide block is that it creates consistency across the country. Earlier court rulings that only protected certain groups led to a situation where different people were subject to different legal standards depending on whether they were connected to the lawsuits. A nationwide injunction removes that confusion by applying the same rule everywhere, at least temporarily. Courts sometimes prefer this approach when a federal regulation has widespread effects and could create uncertainty if enforced unevenly. At the same time, a nationwide block does not represent the final outcome of the case. Instead, it serves as a temporary measure meant to preserve the status quo while the courts carefully evaluate the legal arguments. The judges will still need to determine whether the rule was created within the limits of federal authority and whether it complies with existing laws and constitutional principles. Because of that, the legal process could continue through additional hearings, appeals, and possibly higher courts before a permanent resolution is reached. Beyond the immediate impact on firearm owners, this case is being closely watched because it could influence how federal agencies create and enforce regulations in the future. At the center of the dispute is a broader legal question about the limits of administrative authority. Federal agencies are responsible for implementing and enforcing laws that Congress passes, but courts sometimes must decide whether an agency has gone beyond interpreting a law and instead effectively created a new one through regulation. In this situation, the legal debate focuses on whether reclassifying certain brace-equipped firearms as short-barreled rifles represents a reasonable interpretation of existing law or whether it crosses into lawmaking authority that belongs to Congress. Supporters of the rule argue that agencies must sometimes update their interpretations when technology, products, or market practices evolve. From this perspective, regulatory agencies have the expertise needed to apply existing statutes to modern circumstances and close potential loopholes that were not anticipated when the law was originally written. Opponents, however, argue that the scale of the change is what makes the issue so significant. They claim that millions of firearms were sold legally under previous regulatory guidance, and redefining those firearms through a new rule effectively expands the reach of existing law without lawmakers directly approving the change. According to this argument, such a major shift should require new legislation passed by Congress rather than a reinterpretation issued through administrative rulemaking. Because of these competing views, the outcome of the case could become an important legal precedent. If courts decide that the agency exceeded its authority, it may limit how far federal agencies can go when interpreting older laws to regulate modern products. On the other hand, if the rule is upheld, it could reinforce the idea that agencies have broad flexibility to reinterpret statutes when they believe existing regulations no longer address current realities. Either outcome could shape how future regulations are created, challenged, and reviewed across a wide range of policy areas, not just firearms. The next phase of the case will depend on how the court rules on the request for a broader injunction and how both sides respond to that decision. If the court decides to expand the current block into a nationwide injunction, enforcement of the rule would remain paused while the legal challenge continues. This would give the court more time to carefully review the arguments presented by both the plaintiffs and the government, without the regulation being actively enforced during that period. However, even if the court issues a nationwide block, that would not be the final step in the legal process. The underlying lawsuit still needs to move forward through the normal judicial procedures. This means the court will eventually need to issue a full ruling on whether the regulation is lawful and whether the agency had the authority to implement it under existing federal law. That process may involve additional legal filings, hearings, and a detailed review of statutory interpretation, administrative law principles, and constitutional questions raised in the case. It is also very possible that whichever side loses at the trial court level will choose to appeal the decision. Appeals allow higher courts to review whether the lower court correctly applied the law when making its ruling. If an appeal is filed, the case could move to a federal appellate court where a panel of judges would examine the legal reasoning behind the decision. Appellate rulings can either uphold the lower court's decision, reverse it, or send the case back for further proceedings. Because of the national importance of the issue, some legal observers believe the dispute could eventually reach the highest level of the federal court system. Cases involving major regulatory questions and constitutional interpretations often continue through multiple stages of review before a final outcome is reached. As a result, while recent developments represent a significant moment in the case, the broader legal fight over the regulation may still take considerable time before a definitive resolution is established. This is a rapidly developing legal battle, and the outcome could reshape how firearm regulations are handled in the future. As new court decisions emerge, they could impact millions of firearm owners and the broader debate over federal regulatory power. Stay tuned for updates as this story continues to unfold, and if you want clear, straightforward breakdowns of major legal and policy developments, make sure to subscribe and follow for the latest updates.